You won't see it on the news, you won't hear it in the headlines, because it's not coming suddenly. It's been unfolding quietly for years. Factories closing, prices rising, systems glitching. And yet, everyone scrolls, laughs, pretends. They think the collapse will look dramatic. They expect the noise, the sirens, the collapse with a date stamped on it. But the truth is subtler. The fall that matters wears normal clothes. It arrives as small failures, almost polite, that accumulate until the polite becomes violent. We remember 1929 because it explained itself to us in dramatic pictures: bank lines, ruined farmers, foreclosed homes. We remember 2008 for images of homes emptied and executives on television promising fixes while the market bled. Those years gave us a story with a beginning and an ending. We have learned their vocabulary, and we carry their metaphors like talismans. Yet when a crisis looks different, when it moves through more gears of the machine at once, and when the tools that once fixed it are exhausted, our metaphors fail us. The language of previous collapses becomes inadequate. In 1929, stocks fell 90% over years, and a generation was upended. In 2008, housing imploded, and banks teetered on the edge of ruin. Those moments taught us tactics: cut rates, bail out systemically important institutions, reassure the public. They taught us that a determined economic hand deployed at the right moment could staunch the bleed. But the toolkit that steadied us then is worn, and parts of it have been used until they no longer function the way they used to. So pay attention not only to the numbers, the ratios and the ratios of ratios, but to what the numbers imply about our collective capacity. Valuations speak about greed and narrative. Leverage speaks about fragility. Debt speaks about deferred pain. Demographics and geopolitics speak about the environment in which these economic events breathe. A single measure alone is an alarm bell. Several alarms ringing together form a pattern: nodes, ties, and feedback loops. The pattern we live in is dangerous because it is systemic in three domains at once: equities, real estate, bonds. And because these three domains can no longer be separated by neat institutional escapes. Look at the stock market. In an earlier era, extreme valuations were isolated to sectors or speculative episodes that could be quarantined. In 2025, concentration makes the entire market an amplified vessel of a few narratives. A handful of companies represent a disproportionate share of market value. Their fall would not be a local catastrophe. It would tug the advanced nervous system of global finance and create a cascade. That cascade travels fast because modern markets are linked by speed and derivatives. There is less time and space for reasoned responses. Look at housing. What was once local and tied to wages became financialized into an asset class for global capital. Home price appreciation divorced from income growth is not simply an affordability problem. It is a structural mismatch. In 2008, subprime lending and opaque securitization were the center of gravity. Today, the overvaluation is broader and in many places deeper. Commercial real estate sits with vacancies and mortgages written when rates were low. These properties were underwritten on assumptions that no longer hold. When those loans come due, there will be choices, and few of them will be painless. And bonds, the supposed refuge, cannot be relied upon this time. Governments are heavily indebted, and global fiscal space is limited. The old prescription of fleeing to government debt when equities fall relies on the idea that the state's debt is safe and absorbent. But when sovereign balance sheets lean heavily on cheap financing, and when demographics and trade balances shift, the bond market can become as unstable as the asset it was meant to anchor. That the anchor could fray while the rest of the ship lists makes the options for policymakers narrower and the consequences more severe. This triad, concentrated equities, overvalued real estate, exhausted sovereign capacity, is a constellation that changes the grammar of crisis. Crisis is no longer a single verse, but a symphony of failing instruments, each amplifying the next. The consequences reach beyond balance sheets into the rhythms of everyday life. That is where the collapse risks shedding the cold technical label and becoming a civilizational phenomenon. To understand the civilizational dimension, consider social memory and skills. In earlier eras, resilience was an embedded competency. Societies knew how to repair, to rebuild, to improvise. People had redundant capacities as part of daily life. They grew food, fixed machinery, traded locally, and relied on community norms in ways that were operationally robust when central systems failed. Over the last decades, efficiency and optimization replaced redundancy. We streamlined systems, a wise managerial choice in times of low volatility, but the streamlining left us brittle when volatility returned. Think about an entire economy that learns to forget the craftsmanship of survival. It is not merely a cultural loss, it is a structural liability. When we lose basic capacities, our fallback options thin. That is the moral arithmetic underlying the economic math. Losing skills and social cohesion magnifies the damage of financial failure. Additionally, the political economy matters. Governments that relied on growth to mask structural imbalances now find their room for maneuver curtailed. Debt has been used as a temporary fix, a smoothing device, even as the longer-term sustainability of budgets and obligations went unattended. That choice requires attention because it ties together the capacity to respond with the political credibility necessary to implement painful adjustments. Without credibility, you cannot act. Without action, pathology deepens. The psychological dimension is perhaps the most insidious. Societies habituate. They adjust to high prices, to inequality, to new norms of working and consuming. When the normal becomes abnormal, people often do not notice because the abnormal is normalized by repetition. That habituation is dangerous because it delays cognitive and political responses. We tell ourselves comforting beliefs, that markets only decline to be rescued, that technology guarantees improvement, that policy always finds the fix. Those comforts became beliefs, and beliefs are political as much as they are cognitive. History is instructive. In 1929, large swathes of the population were not directly invested in equities. The shock traveled but did not obliterate immediate savings everywhere. In 2008, the pain centered in housing and the finance sector, and the systemic response, coordinated bailouts and policy interventions, bought time. The distribution of exposure and the policy levers determined the experience of the crisis. Today, exposure is broad. Retirement accounts, index funds, and the ubiquity of financial instruments mean that shocks land across the societal map immediately. This is why the social consequences will be faster, more visible and more politically charged. But beyond distribution, there is the question of legitimacy. If institutions are perceived to protect some while exposing others, social trust will fracture. When the political community perceives unfairness during crisis response, cohesion diminishes. The restoration of stability is not a purely technical act. It requires the sense that sacrifice and benefit are shared fairly. Where that perception is absent, cooperation breaks down and the crisis becomes deeper. What should an individual listening to this do? First, understand that preparedness is not merely a checklist of goods. Physical goods have a role: food, water, basic tools. But the essential investments are social capital, skills, and local networks. Learn practical skills that make you functionally less dependent on a highly optimized global supply chain. Cultivate relationships within your local community that can serve as mutual aid networks when centralized systems fray. Build small redundancies in your household: short-term food supplies, basic tools, a plan for contingencies that include information and communication strategies. Financially, rethink exposure. Broad market ownership means systemic exposure. Consider diversification not just in assets but across income streams and practical security. Liquid cash has value in chaotic moments, but cash can also be eroded by inflation or rendered temporarily worthless by banking disruptions. Gold and hard assets are part of the story, but they are not a panacea. The most reliable hedge often lies in a combination of modestly hedged financial positions and tangible, practical capacity. Political engagement matters. Demand public policies that rebuild resilience, investments in infrastructure that create redundancy rather than brittle efficiency, social programs that maintain public trust and avoid deepening inequality. regulatory reforms that reduce systemic leverage and the implicit subsidy to concentrated risks. A citizenry in a democracy that demands prudence and clear accountability increases the likelihood that institutions respond effectively. Above all, cultivate attention. Collapses that arrive quietly exploit inattention. The early signs of faltering are often small and localized. A plant closure, a bank reporting unexpected losses, rising delinquencies in consumer credit. When those signals accumulate, the systemic response requires leadership and public comprehension. Build the habit of noticing small changes in your environment and connecting them to larger trends. Curiosity is not paranoia, it is civic competence. We must also resist the temptation to treat this message as fatalism. Human systems are not purely deterministic. People respond, adapt, and invent. The Great Depression produced civic innovations. The Great Recession produced new regulatory frameworks. The fragility we see today can be repaired if we act with humility and seriousness. But repair demands urgency and honesty. It demands leaders who will not default to comforting myth and institutions that can coordinate effective action without perpetuating injustice. Now return for a moment to the images that we remember from past crises. Those images were not merely economic, they were moral. They revealed who had been protected by the system and who had been exposed. In the coming years, the images will be similarly moral. How we respond will determine whether we feature stories of creative adaptation or of social blame and fragmentation. This is not a call to panic. Panic rewards predators and paralyzes communities. It is a call to attention and action. Learn the contours of the risk, build capacity, revalue local competence, ask for policies that reduce hollow concentration, rebuild public goods, and restore the conditions for shared prosperity. Institutions can change if they are pressured by informed citizens who understand the stakes. We are close to a turning point because the set of circumstances, interlinked overvaluations, exhausted policy tools, demographic headwinds, geopolitical fragmentation, reduces the margin for error. The collapse you imagine as sudden is likely to be a sequence of failures, each one emboldening the next. The difference from 1929 and 2008 is not merely magnitude, but the interplay of multiple failing instruments at once and the erosion of the social and political capacities that used to absorb shocks. We will live through choices. The system is not totally doomed, nor is it guaranteed to be repaired. The outcome will depend on action and moral imagination. If political leaders still prioritize short-term optics over long-term resilience, the damage will deepen. If citizens demand courage and prudence, and if communities mobilize practical reserves of skills and mutual aid, the damage can be limited and recovery accelerated. This is the calculus of our time. The collapse is closer than you think because the conditions that produced past collapses are present and compounded. The question is whether we will treat the proximity of collapse as a fatalistic prophecy or as an urgent call to rebuild. The lines between economic facts and moral choices have always been porous. Money is a medium of exchange and a repository of confidence. When confidence fractures, money can change its character rapidly. In a modern economy, where so many promises are recorded digitally and depend on continuous trust in institutions, the loss of that confidence can be profoundly destabilizing. It follows then that restoration of confidence is as much political as it is monetary. We must remember that not all institutions are equal in capacity or legitimacy. Some institutions will be able to act quickly and with competence. Others will be hamstrung by politics, by inertia, or by depleted resources. The aging infrastructure of many states is a reminder that the ability to act depends on pre-existing strength. If governments are already overextended, their responses will be constrained, and the burden will shift onto communities with unequal capacity to shoulder it. A key dynamic in the modern era is the distribution of control over productive assets. When production is concentrated globally, localities lose optionality. The loss of manufacturing capabilities in many regions is not simply an industrial statistic, it is a vulnerability that shows up in shortages, price spikes, and delayed responses when crises disrupt supply chains. Rebuilding optionality means encouraging local and regional capacities to provide basic goods, food, energy, medical supplies, and essential services. Practical resilience is not just an economic policy, it is a strategy for human survival in uncertain times. Another dynamic is social trust. When trust declines, people act selfishly, hoard resources, and withdraw from cooperative systems. The response to crisis then becomes a scramble rather than a coordinated effort. Restoring trust requires transparency and policies perceived as fair. That means targeted protections for the vulnerable, while also making it costly for elites to exploit emergency programs. Fairness under pressure keeps social cohesion intact. It is also vital to watch the information environment. In a crisis, clear channels of truthful communication can prevent rumor, panic, and the misallocation of resources. But modern information channels amplify speed and distortion. Misinformation can become a contagion that complicates mitigation and sows deeper division. Strengthening public communication and investing in trustworthy intermediaries matters. To practical audiences, consider that when banks face runs and deposit insurance is insufficient, the response will likely include extraordinary government actions that will reshape the currency, credit access, and the distribution of assets. The short-run cost of making deposits whole may mean inflationary outcomes later. Planning for such possibilities is not speculation, it is contingency planning. For those who build and run businesses, resilience means re-examining leverage, repricing risk, and planning for lower demand scenarios. For households, it means stabilizing essential expenses, reducing dependency on volatile income, and strengthening community ties that can provide reciprocal assistance. For local governments and civil society, it means ensuring that basic services, water, healthcare access, emergency management, can be maintained under fiscal stress. We should not underestimate the political consequences. Economic distress tends to increase political volatility and can lead to policy shifts that would have been unthinkable in times of stable growth. The risk is not only economic pain, but institutional polarization that prevents coordinated policymaking. The historical record shows that societies can either harden into exclusion or open new institutions for mutual support. The direction depends on leadership and civic engagement. A critical skill for individuals and communities is scenario thinking. Imagine plausible futures and design responses that are robust across several plausible scenarios. That includes scenarios where markets recover quickly, scenarios where a protracted depression occurs, and scenarios of stagflation or fragmented regional recoveries. Policies and preparations that perform reasonably well across a range of scenarios are preferable to those optimized for a single assumed outcome. Education matters too. Teaching practical skills in schools, supporting apprenticeship programs, and funding community-based training invests in long-term resilience. The loss of these pathways over decades contributes to fragility. The reintroduction of such skills must be pursued not as nostalgia, but as an investment in adaptive capacity. We must not romanticize collapse. The human cost is real and enormous. Families lose savings and homes. Public services become constrained. Vulnerable populations suffer disproportionately. That is why the ethical dimension is unavoidable. Who bears the cost, how the cost is distributed, and how recovery is organized are moral questions directly linked to economic choices. Yet even with the weight of these realities, the narrative is not without hope. Societies adapt, evolve, and sometimes achieve institutional renewal in the wake of crisis. The Great Depression brought social insurance and a new architecture of state capacity in many countries. The disruptions of 2008 brought reforms to financial oversight and a rethinking of risk. The question is whether we can act faster now, recognizing the compound fragility and rebuilding before the worst of the cascade arrives. If you are listening to this as a call to action, let the action be twofold. First, immediate practical steps to enhance local resilience and personal preparedness. Second, civic and political engagement aimed at structural change, reducing concentration, repairing balance sheets, and creating policies that encourage redundancy and equitable protection. Push for public investments in infrastructure that reduce fragility, not merely in projects that increase nominal GDP. Advocate for policies that constrain excessive leverage and concentration. Demand accountability from institutions that profited from short-termism. If this analysis matters to you and you want more examinations like this, deep, historical and practical, consider supporting the channel. A single click to like or subscribe helps this work reach more people who need to know. It costs nothing, and it changes how the conversation spreads. You can help keep this voice independent, one thoughtful viewer at a time. Finally, cultivate attitudes that sustain cooperative action. Pride of place should be given to pragmatic humility, a willingness to sacrifice comfort for durable stability, and a readiness to rebuild skills that link us to local realities. Collapse is not an inevitability written in stone. It is an outcome shaped by choices we make now. You won't see it on the news. You won't hear it in the headlines. They will label it something reassuring at first. A blip, a correction, a temporary setback. But the small failures will aggregate. The protective myths will unravel. The specialized instruments that once offered protection will fail together. When that day comes, the consequences will echo through communities and through public trust. Take this as instruction, not prophecy. Prepare with intentionality. Reconnect with your local networks. Learn practical skills. Advocate for policies that rebuild resilience. The collapse is closer than you think, and the distance between where we are and where we could be depends on our collective attention and action right now. This is not the end of the story. It is a call to write a better chapter, not with slogans or panic, but with measured, courageous work. Understand the danger, mobilize resources, demand change. In the overlap between comprehension and action lies our possibility for a different outcome. You are living through an era of systemic stress. Notice it, learn from it, build for it, and in doing so, do your part to remake the conditions that will determine whether the next chapter is one of regeneration or of deepening fracture. The collapse is closer than you think, and understanding that closeness is where agency begins.